Good evening, everybody. A late start today. I had a couple things going on this morning with a good friend of mine, and so didn't get around to today's Wall Street Journal. I read it early this morning, but didn't get around to summarizing until late tonight. So I hope it's okay. So probably 7 or 8 little snippets today, and I hope you find them interesting. Hope you find them thought provoking. Let's dive into the first one. Countries fighting over companies. So I thought this is interesting in a space to watch is we've seen here recently with ByteDance and the issue about TikTok and U.S. combined now with Oracle's trying to take it over from the Chinese, right? And so many of us have known that the Chinese are involved in a lot of their companies. Whether it's a private company in China is hard to define because the government's always back there. Exercising a lot more control than we would in the U.S. So, this issue about ByteDance is getting real sticky because ByteDance wants to keep Chinese ownership. They want to keep all the intellectual property. And then, of course, Oracle says we'll keep the data in the U.S. and the servers in the U.S. and we won't give any of the data to the Chinese so they can't spy on our citizens. So is that going to be enough or not? And that's the big argument going on right now, and they still haven't decided that. So, who retains the majority, ownership? Chinese right now want to keep that. Who owns the data and who can view? Tough questions. But the larger issue I want to point out is more and more we're seeing larger issues with fights with companies, especially in the technology space, that are getting into the country space. So companies are now fighting countries and on a global basis. And you're seeing that with Facebook. They're having to deal with European Union, they're having to deal with the US, all separately, all doing different things. Many of them want the data and the servers in their own country right now. That's a real kind of a baseline decision right now that they're saying, look, and this is the TikTok thing, is you're not putting this data over in China and not taking data from our citizens and using it for nefarious means or whatever means. So I think you should watch this space and kind of think about this when you're seeing some of these fights that we're getting, mixing in government regulations to so-called private companies. And I think the sheer size of them, Facebook is an example, TikTok, with billion users. I mean, this is a huge deal. So I think we should watch it. I'll watch it and try to see if there's any articles that come out in that area. Snowflake, you might have heard about this recent company. They just had their IPO, came out at $120 and it quickly doubled to $253. And so this company's emblematic of the tech sector right now and how high flying and the huge market capitalization these companies are having. This is a database company. Now, at first glance, you look at it and say, what can be that sexy and exciting about a database company? Buffett's, by the way, an investor, whether that means something to you or not, but they've got a lot of money. I'm sure that they didn't put it at the 253 mark. They were probably well below the 120 mark. To get in early, but certainly gives a credibility to the IPO. But they do something different. Snowflake does something different where they're having these databases out there, and they tie these databases together. Even though they're separate companies, you can tie the data from one company to another company. Obviously, if both companies agree, and have a better view of your market. So there are some intriguing things about them that I found pretty intriguing, but at the end of the day, a database is a pretty simple thing. I know I got some friends that'll argue with me, but they really are pretty simple things. Lots of people, including Oracle, by the way, Microsoft, lots of people in that business. So they must be doing something right. Huge growth, double customers and big customers in the first year. So they must be doing something right. Watch Snowflake. No, I'm not going to invest today in them. The market capitalization, the price to sales ratio is like 185 right now. It's just through the roof. It's crazy in my mind. But I wish I would have got in at about $40 or $50 this year. Another thing I want you to watch. You know, Barr, Attorney General Barr, has gotten into these local protests and local violence in the local cities. And this is intriguing to look at. Now, if you look at what's happening with these riots are happening in primarily Democratic, liberal led cities. The police will arrest some, 20, 30 a day. They take them off to jail. Local prosecution has got this progressive attitude towards decriminalization. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And so they believe these to be low level crimes and let them out. And generally, by the way, within hours, they go right back to the protests, right back to the violence. And so it's a catch and release program. So there's no reason why the protesters won't keep doing what they're doing, because there's no punishment in for them. And they don't have to go defend themselves before a judge or anything. They're back on the street. So you can see that Trump was very frustrated with this and says, "I'll send my police in. We ought to call the National Guard." Of course, these liberal people didn't want anybody to help out, especially federal, right? The state, some cases, they let the National Guard in there. In Portland, they had no choice because they were destroying a federal courthouse, a federal building. I want to be careful. I'm not sure that was a courthouse or not, but I think it was. And so the federal police came in and they stopped that very quickly, and it worked, right? They had to move on. They couldn't, they put fencing up and they kept them away from the courthouse. But local people didn't like it. Lots of states' rights people didn't like it at all and thought that that was an overstep by Barr and Trump. So now you've got Barr doing something differently, where he's looking at federal charges against some of these protesters. And so the federal charges are around the area of sedition, and maybe it's not a term you're familiar with. Sedition is defined as inciting people to riot against the state. And when I say the state there, I don't mean the state of Seattle. I mean the federal state, the federal government. So he's looking at that as a way to say, okay, they're trying to overthrow the U.S. government. So, you got to ask yourself, is this what we want to do? And I've always been one of those people that look back and forth between state rights and federal rights. I think in many cases, and I've called Trump out on this before, that I think he's got into the area of states' rights, some areas when I believe that he was pushing the right to do that. So is this something that we want to do? But it may be that some of these people are very dangerous people and want to overthrow the government. If that's the case, local people are the worst people to go do that, right? They have the least resources. They can't look at them nationally. They can only look at them, for instance, in Portland. So maybe the federal government is the place to go figure out where these people are far from and where they funded from. If there's simple protesters off the street, that'll come out very quickly. So it could be, with some federal help, that we could locate some hidden support organizations that are underneath this. If they are, I'm not saying they are. I don't know that they are. A lot of accusations have been made around that area, but I think very little evidence has come. And some of these organizations are very loosely held. So would it help? And then, of course, the last question is, would it discourage violence? Well, certainly now you got to get a lawyer and defend yourself, and this is big time. I mean, sedition is 20 years, so this is real serious now. This has nothing to do with burning a building down. It's big time, and federal courts, a lot of money and a lot of time. It may discourage some of the violence and get us back to protests, which I think all of us are for. So interesting discussion there. Watch the space as Barr heads in there. There's a lot of things out there on sedition. A lot of people believe it should have never been part of our law, that it was an overstep and used used to be targeted against specific groups and brought up when you wanted to. Maybe in this case, Trump, as Barr, is doing it, but I appreciate to hear from you. Protests erasing a line in the sand. So, interesting thing about the protest that Wall Street Journal's called out. If you notice in the protest that you've got these protesters that are standing right up an inch from the face of a policeman or policewoman and screaming at them, spit flying to them, screaming at them, calling them all sorts of names, and accusing them of various things. So, and of course, the cops just have to stand there and take it. So, in the past, I think all of us would have looked at that and said that wouldn't have been tolerated. They would have pulled a billy club out and pushed you back with the club, and I think the club would have hit you on the way back. So, so now we've increased this level of toleration of what we're tolerating, okay, from these protesters. And what would you allow, by the way? Think about yourself. Will you allow somebody to get within 2 inches of your face and start screaming and calling you all sorts of names? I think most of us would not tolerate that. That's violating our personal space. And we would think that would be unconstitutional. It's free speech or otherwise. So then you got to ask yourself, have we crossed a line of the fear of police? And I know we've got this other thing about fear of police. Maybe it went too far. And I get it. I know some policemen have taken advantage of that. This is a case where now we've taken it to the other side. Is this good? I don't know. Progressives are moving to decriminalize many of these things. So they're taking away the fear of police when you decriminalize these acts, and you're going to get more and more of them. And, in baseball, you've got to be very careful that as soon as you touch that person, right, that umpire, they've drawn that line. So you touch, in fact, some cases you can't talk to the umpire. In certain cases, you can't, for instance, argue a strike or a ball. They get away with it, but technically they can't. So voters are noticing. Many people are showing the polls that the polls in swing states with these protests going on are swinging or around. So, yeah. And by the way, and I want to show this a comment from Roger, a good comment. If, being the operative, right, they have committed crimes of sedition, then only the federal government can prosecute. So it's a good point, and I wanted to draw that point. Only the federal government, the local people can't do anything about it. So great point, Raj. And next question, back to work. I want to talk about a small company called Firehouse Strategies. Had an article in the Wall Street Journal, March 13th. They sent everybody home. They said, you got to work from home. This is a financial company, small financial company, less than 100 people. They said, interesting enough, productivity went up. No travel time, right? And so they're working at the house all 8-9 hours and a lot of productivity. But as the months went by, they noticed the big notice was missing creativity. And so that really was a thing that they noticed. And they noticed they were getting involved in a lot more inter-office personnel strains. And the strain had increased between personnel. So just a couple weeks ago, they went back to the office, said everybody back to the office. Meanwhile, they said actually productivity has now gone up again. Morale went up tremendously, and the revenue is starting to flow in. They're starting to see increased revenue because of that. They're one of those, and I've argued this back and forth on both sides, that believe we can't do this long term. Certain types of companies need the creativity. I think I would miss the ability to go over to Joe's office and just walk in the door and say, Joe, I got this idea. How do you do that on Zoom or telephone? And how do you see what's the person's expression? They look at you like, this is the craziest idea I've ever gotten, and you just leave. And so I think that's interesting. The real cost of the Biden plans. I'm being called to dinner here real quick. I got a few more. So if you look at the Biden tax plans, be careful when you hear this. And this is why we really have to be careful with government control. They'll say you that there's no new taxes if you earn under $400,000 a year. No new taxes, okay? So now you got to define, the smart person says, what does taxes mean, okay? So then you got to say, well, Vice President Biden, or President Biden, if he makes it, are you going to increase regulation? So if he increases regulation, is that taxation? So many of us would say, absolutely. That is a stealth taxation, we call it. So regulations are a stealth taxation, especially on the poor, by the way. They typically affect the poor. The rich people can get around it. So let me give you a couple examples. California recently said you build a new house, mandatory solar panels. Okay. So to a person making $1 million a year, no big deal. You've just added $20,000 to my house, 30,000, somewhere around that. To a poor person that's just barely getting in, it's a regressive tax, right? Thank you, Joe. To a poor person just trying to barely qualify for this house, that's a huge tax on top of that. You've just now upped their mortgage by $20,000. And so I give you an example from my house. Our house had mandatory sprinkler systems. I know we have them in every room. And by the way, they're boiler system qualified. You can't just hire a regular plumber to work on it. They're under pressure all the time, by the way. They have to be cleaned out occasionally. They have sensors on them. They connect directly to the fire. They'll set a fire alarm off if they set off. So you got to have very specialized people to work on it. That was a tax on this house. Did I want it? No. But because I live in this community, every new house in this community has to have it. An active regulatory state is a playground for the privileged class to indulge at the expense of ordinary Americans. So next time you see these plans and they say, don't worry, ordinary Americans, they always say working Americans. It always irritated me because I guess I wasn't a working American since I was in, upper class of income. But they always said working Americans, no new taxes. They are new taxes. And so be careful about that. The last quick thing I wanted to point out is factories are missing workers. So this thing with kids not being in school, factories are noticing. A half of the manufacturers right now said it's difficult to get full staff right now because many of their workers that are already trained and ready to go are staying at home caring for children that have to be at home because the school isn't opened yet. So this is a big deal. I think we're going to see when schools open, watch for a dramatic increase in output and GDP as we get lots of these people who are pseudo school teachers right now, okay, and not being paid for it. By the way, they paid their taxes. This may be double taxation, a weird thought, and now they're having to assist the online school teacher with their kids and watch over. Remember, school as daycare, and I know, boy, schools hate that term, but it's a big deal, right? You allow people to go off and make a living and do other things, and we've learned that in third world countries. It's a big deal if you can get kids in school. You free up members of the family to do other things and become more and more productive and better in their family. So I've got to hurry off to dinner tonight and with some friends, but hope you enjoyed. Appreciate your comments real quick, and see you tomorrow. Cheers.